Hi, everybody. Welcome to Mormonish. I'm Rebecca.
And I'm Landon.
And we have a wonderful guest with us today. We have Elise Boxer. How are you today?
I'm doing good, thank you.
We are so excited to talk to you about this topic today. We've had this we make show notes kind of like, what do we want to cover eventually someday? This has always been on the list for a very long time. And we've been trying to find the right person who can talk about this to us. So we're really, really thrilled to have connected with you. And I think, Landon, why don't you read Elise's bio and then we'll just kind of start the conversation. I think everyone's going to find this really important and really fascinating.
Okay. Elise Boxer, she's from the Dakota tribe, Associate Professor of History and Native American Studies at the University of South Dakota and Director of the Institute of American Indian Studies, focuses her research on Mormon settler colonialism and indigeneity. She is the co-author of an edited volume from the Skin, Defending Indigenous Nations Using Theory and Praxis, is part of the Critical Indigenous Studies series with the University of Arizona Press. Her forthcoming book, To Become White and Delightsome, The Formations of Lamanites and Mormon Whiteness, will be published fall 2025 with the University of Oklahoma. In her professional and personal work, she is interested in reclaiming Dakota cultural practices and teaches cultural arts to University of South Dakota students. Her most important work happens as a mother to 3 young boys. So that sounds like a really interesting book.
No, and we also, I don't know if you're aware, we run a post-Mormon book club called the Good Book Club. So we will definitely put that on our list for next fall, because that's exactly the kind of book that we like to, just kind of revisit the past, right? To understand where we are, how we got here, and how to move forward. So this book sounds amazing. So, well, we are really excited that you're here. And maybe, we read your bio, that's that, but why don't you just tell us a little bit about who you are and we will get started.
Okay, well, I think first and foremost, I typically usually start with my introduction that I am an enrolled citizen of the Fort Peck Sioux Assiniboine tribe. And my tribe is located in Northeast Montana, and that's primarily where I grew up. And my father moved us over here to Yakima Nation and Toppenish. And that's where I kind of grew up, like the other part of my childhood. So really I do consider myself somebody who grew up in a tribal community. But I consider home to be in Poplar, Montana. I also grew up as a member of the LDS Church. And my parents were converts. And different places at times. So my father is from Fort Peck, that's where he's enrolled. My mother's from California, but they have like a very kind of probably common story where they met at BYU. They both converted, like as I mentioned, in the day of the Lamanite. But I would consider myself in a sense like second generation LDS. But the community that I grew up in, I would say that Mormonism looks very different. And that's really what my next book project is going to be on, where like the LDS Church did not really get to begin converting like Dakota people really until like the 1950s and 60s in my community, much later than other reservations. But our community and the way we practice Mormonism, I think, is very different and interesting, but also aligns in interesting ways, especially when we talk about family and kinship. I will also say that I have a very probably critical perspective of the LDS Church, in the sense that my book that is forthcoming next year, I'm just really interested in looking at like infrastructures, both physical, but also social and cultural. And I specifically look at what I call this idea of Mormon settler colonialism. And the reason why I'm interested in, and especially the Indian Student Placement Program is just one chapter in my forthcoming book, is because I'm interested in really, again, the structures, right, like that exist within the LDS Church, but really how Indigenous people fit into that. And how did like Joseph Smith's vision, right, but also really the Book of Mormon and their ideas of Lamanite people or Indigenous people really shape what it means to be Indigenous, in the 19th and 20th century. And that Mormonism policies often reflect U.S. policies of assimilation, this idea of kill the Indian, save the man. And specifically, I do reference this in one of my publications where I talk about, since we're coming up on the month of July, July 24th and looking at like Mormon pioneers and settlers moving west. I'm really interested in also, again, that as a structure, how Mormon settlers moved west, claimed Indigenous land, and made land that was once Indigenous Mormon, and how they did that by shaping the land, claiming resources, etc. But really my interest out of the Indian Student Placement Program came out of the result of a conversation I had as a graduate student. So I was finishing my second year of doctoral work at Arizona State University. I happened to go on a vacation with a friend that we did our master's degree together at Utah State University. And I was on a trip with her and her friends, people I never met before, but that was interesting about the group of her and her friends was they served a mission together, I think in Houston, Texas. So they knew each other for quite a bit of time. I was like the add-on. And it was just interesting because we had conversations. All of us were members. Everybody was at various stages in the relationship, I would say, to Mormonism. But there's always those questions about what it means to be American Indian and Mormon, and what does that look like? And, and then also just general questions of these individuals, and specifically one individual has never really encountered Native people for the most part, didn't grow up in, I would say, in a diverse area or an area where there are Native peoples and Native communities. So a lot of the questions were very, let's say not just prejudiced, but racist. And so out of that conversation, I remember her asking about the Book of Mormon and if I considered the Book of Mormon my history. And I said, that's not our history. Like as Dakota people, our creation stories and our history as a people, it's not, and it won't be found in the Book of Mormon. And, and then the conversation kind of continued, and ultimately, like what came of the conversation is that, the current status of reservations today, right, as like socioeconomically depressed, etc., right, all the stereotypes and negatives you can think about Native peoples, she likened it unto like the Book of Mormon, that we are basically like a dark people, we are uncivilized, we're savage, we've always been a warfaring people, and that if I understood my own history, I would understand that my history was the Book of Mormon. And that just blew my mind because I was like, wait, what? And so, to this day, I can't remember what I said, but I know that I was unapologetic in my criticism and pushback against that. Because one, it was like racist, but two, it was like, you can't just say things like that and, not take offense to what my comments are going to be. But it piqued my interest because this was an individual who graduated from Brigham Young University, served a mission in the LDS Church, but also was in their first year of law school at the University of Utah. So somebody who by any like social standards would be considered very educated, right? And it concerned me that this individual, this was their, I would say, like experience of Native people or their understanding of Native people, very much shaped by, I think, the rhetoric within the Book of Mormon. And that just like, I shifted my topic as a graduate student to talk about and be interested in looking at the LDS Church's understanding of Native people and what does it mean. And in that dissertation, I do have one chapter on, again, the Indian Student Placement Program, but that's really where the interest began. And it has, I would say, developed over time in the ways in which I look at the LDS Church's relationship and understanding of Native people. And then I think just to kind of frame, I think the other part of leading up to talking specifically about the Indian Student Placement Program, I think it's easy, right? Like oftentimes I think it's easy to focus on like the individual, right? Like, okay, yeah, like somebody is maybe racist, they may not be, but we all exist within these systems. And that's really what I'm interested in. Again, like these systems or infrastructures in which racism changes and shapes policies. And so I mean, I'm sure like your listeners have like an understanding of the Book of Mormon, etc. But just in a very, I think, just a kind of brief overview, I just want to kind of first acknowledge is that like, the change in the Book of Mormon from like the title page, right, where they talk about, I think it was 1984, like American Indians, are the direct descendants, right, of Lamanites, and then later changed to maybe among. But it's interesting because I will say within the cultural fabric of the LDS Church and membership, like that sentiment that American Indians are in fact Lamanites persists. Even with the Come Follow Me manual, I think it was 4 years ago, right? Like when they published some of the same racist rhetoric about Indigenous people, but that still persists. Those ideas and attitudes still persist. And so that's why I think talking about this particular program is interesting, but I place it into a larger conversation because what I think is important to acknowledge about like the LDS Church and I know I'm going to use the word Mormons because that was what's used as the time. I know the LDS Church, right, put out like their notification saying they want to be called like the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints or like the church or whatnot. But I will say the LDS Church specifically, but then I'll also use Mormons because that's just been, common, I would say, cultural terminology that people have used and the church has used historically. But I think what's happening in terms of looking at the Indian student placement program specifically, it starts as I would say people want to call it as an informal program, and I would argue it's not informal. It was an illegal program that was started in the American Southwest by missionaries on the Navajo Nation. And people point to the young girl, Helen John, who was Navajo. Her family, right, was like a migrant farm worker family and kind of pleaded with her, like, the Mormon family to stay, that they could host her. And she becomes kind of, I would say, like the poster child, right, for the Indian Student Placement Program as a justification, right, to not just for her, but eventually others to be placed into Mormon foster homes. But that original iteration of the program, it was illegal that you were transporting children across state lines, even within the permission with their parents oftentimes, but there was no like oversight for that until much later under like the Relief Society Auxiliary Program.
Hey, Elise,
Yeah.
one thing, some of our listeners are older like us and experienced the Indian Placement Program, but we also have some who probably have no idea what the Indian Placement Program was.
It's
Can you
true.
explain kind of the purpose and kind of the background of it?
Right. So like the Indian Student Placement Program, I think if you look at like the church literature published about it, was really to provide off-reservation opportunities, whether educational, social, cultural, but I think specifically religious opportunities for children off reservation within predominantly Mormon white foster homes. And so these children are coming from initially, again, as I mentioned, Navajo Nation. That expands pretty much to become a national program and extends even into Canada at some point. But those children who participated initially were young, but eventually there were guidelines that were set forth to say children should be at least 8 years old. They should be baptized members of the LDS Church. And, they were going to be placed for 9 months out of the year, right, into foster homes, and that they would be transported from their home location into basically like Mormon churches, like they were used as a center to process, really, for the lack of a better word, these children. They were clean, they were like, etc., went through all of these like health checks. Very much like I would say the experience of Native kids going to boarding schools, where you are physically removing the children. And while the children may not have been renamed, or given like English names or, haircut, they are very much go through the same physical processing in terms of like being cleaned, right, given different clothing, and then their foster families will come pick them up and then take them to the home. It was not funded by the LDS Church in terms of like these Mormon foster families weren't given money to host the children. It was done really, I would say, as kind of like a mandate, like a religious fulfillment of a mandate in which, Gentiles or whatnot should be uplifting Lamanite people. And so it was a way for, I would say, non-Lamanite people to fulfill that religious obligation.
But the church it was a church program. You could go somewhere as a member and say, I want to host
Mhm.
a Native American in my home, or were they just, you volunteered and then they were assigned? How did that all work?
I don't get too much into the logistics of it, but just in general, what happens is you have to be interested, obviously. I think like any other foster program is interested in hosting a child. And then initially, again, the problem is that they aren't going through the same foster parenting that most foster programs require. It's literally if you express interest in hosting a child, if you can afford to host the child and provide for their for like their whatever needs that they may have, then they would allow for you to host that particular family or child. There's a really great article by Jessie Embry, who was like the former director, or I forget her. I apologize for forgetting her official title, but she used to be like associated with the Charles Redd Center at BYU. And she wrote a great article talking about the role of foster parents. So I encourage you or your listeners to kind of look into that, to specifically look at the reasons why people were wanting to foster children. I'm more interested in kind of like just like the structure itself, like the fact that the LDS Church, under the direction of Spencer W. Kimball, initially when he was an apostle, he kind of had it where, we officially can't sanction the program, but please,
Right.
Put together this, oversee this, and then eventually brought it back to, you'll see some of his interviews where he talks about bringing it back to the brethren, and they want it to be a success. And so that's why Helen John becomes important, because she becomes kind of like this, again, poster child where it's like, oh, look, if we can civilize and against native children into Mormon homes, this is an opportunity for us to fulfill, right, that like that religious belief that Lamanite people will blossom as a rose, and even the title to my book, that they shall become white and delightsome. It's that literal, like their civilization through Mormon conversion and being a member of the LDS Church is going to kind of hasten their literal whitening as a people. And so, which again is problematic in and of
Very
itself.
problematic.
Would the kids go back to the same home? And I'm guessing this is from when they were 8 till when they graduated. So
Yeah.
10 years basically in a foster care. Would it be the same family over and over, or would they be moved from?
They would be moved. Yeah. Like sometimes, like, I mean, there
Wow.
are some kids, like I had a friend that I met in school who, she technically should not have graduated with her foster family, because when the program ended, she stayed with that family beyond the official end of the program, because her parents and the foster parents said that it was okay that she stayed with them till she graduated high school. There are kids who are moved from home to home if there was issues. And that's like the other part that people don't necessarily want to talk about because it's so uncomfortable, is like the abuse that children experience within the program. I talk a little bit about, for example, Navajo Nation, where they had the majority of their children who went to participate in like Mormon in the Indian Student Placement Program. There is a group of people who sued the LDS Church for the sexual abuse that they experienced in the foster homes. And I think that goes back to one, the lack of oversight, the lack of like just social workers checking in consistently with children. And it was, I think, just an interesting argument that the Navajo Nation was making in front of the courts in general, because their argument is that typically the way jurisdiction works with Navajo people or just Indian people in general is that you have jurisdiction over your own peoples within the boundaries of like your tribal lands. It changes jurisdiction when it becomes like federal crimes. Then the federal courts typically have jurisdiction over, under the Major Crimes Act. Basically, there's a list of felonies that are covered through federal courts. But their argument is that their children belong to them as a nation. And so their jurisdiction, even though these children are living in primarily Utah and other places, that they have jurisdiction over their own children. And so the LDS Church was contesting that initially, to say they actually don't have jurisdiction. They didn't want the jurisdiction to happen in Navajo Nation court. And those eventually were settled out of court, interestingly enough. But I think for me, I like looking at it in terms of, it's really an exercise of sovereignty for tribal nations to say, you may have taken our children off reservation, but they still are citizens of our nation, and that their jurisdiction extends beyond the boundaries of, let's say, for Navajo Nation specifically. Yeah.
I remember,
can I
I was
ask
going to
you-
say, can
go
I ask
ahead.
one question quick? We have so many questions. We're
Yeah.
so interested. I remember both Landon and I were saying both of us had someone I grew up in Washington State. He grew up in Utah, had a child in our neighborhoods from the Indian Placement Program. And I remember them announcing it at church, asking, would anyone be interested in having this in your home? Please come talk to the bishop. I remember thinking, oh, that'd be really interesting. My family situation, we were not able to do it. But so they definitely were promoting it within church, because I have a distinct memory of hearing about that and wishing my family could do that. So you're right about the structure. The LDS Church definitely was promoting it from within its organizational construct there. So, and then Landon and I were both just saying before we started taping that when those children were in our neighborhood, we knew them as a Lamanite is going to come live in your neighborhood. I mean, that's what we were told. And of course, being raised LDS, we're like, oh, of course, I know exactly who this person is. I know what their heritage is. I know their history. This is a Lamanite. And, you don't realize till you're an adult later and look back at just how wrong that is, how sad that is. So
that was exactly the question I was going to ask, because I know, Elise, you said, when you were in your doctorate degree, or when you were doing your postgraduate, that's when you started looking into this. But as a child growing up Mormon, as a Native American, how did you picture yourself? Did you see yourself as a Lamanite, as a descendant of these people in this book? How did it change you, or how did it make you think of your culture differently because of the fact that you were Mormon? And did you see yourself culturally different than maybe other tribal members that you were around?
I think that's a really great question in general, because I think that's one where, like I said, it's interesting because where I grew up, when you're the predominant group, the majority group, right? There's really no differences in terms of how we see one another. We may be different, whether you're Dakota or Assiniboine or different bands, but part of it is when you go to church, anyone that was non-native typically came off reservation. They were typically part of I'd say the branch leadership. Or they're the missionaries, but you're so used to, I think, seeing who you are, and because you're in your community, you don't see yourself as anything different. I don't remember seeing myself as Lamanite at all. Growing up, I always thought that I was Dakota. My parents instilled with us, it's interesting because my dad, I would say, it's interesting generational differences. My dad, there's a book it's an edited volume by University of Utah. It's essays on Native American history and Mormon history. I have a chapter in there on the Book of Mormon as settler colonialism, but there's a chapter on the Northern Indian Mission that covered part of where I grew up. But interesting, they interviewed my dad there over the phone, and he talks about how he has no problem becoming Lamanite, or he really saw himself as a Lamanite. But I think that speaks to his generation, because he was heavily recruited because of his Lamanite heritage, and recruited to BYU and to some of their programs and whatnot. So I think it was maybe more a part of his consciousness that that's how people saw him. But I would say for myself, I don't see myself that way. And it wasn't really until I moved here to Toppenish. I vividly remember the first time I came into church, and it was I've never seen so many white people at church in my life, and it was a ward. And so it's much bigger on a grander scale, right? And not to say that there weren't other people of color. Yakama Nation's interesting because there's a diversity in terms of Native people, but also I'd say more Latinos, because it's a growing community. That's a very large migrant population. But I didn't really see myself as Lamanite. And in fact, I would say when I was in Poplar growing up, because our church was so small, our branch was so small, our Sunday school, we would have to kind of teach ourselves, or, my mom or other people would come in, or sometimes there's just us and my siblings, to be honest. There's 5 of us. But we used to watch some of those old film strips. I don't know the series name, but I know Benny the Builder was one of them, but they were all used as part of, I think, the Southwest Indian Mission. It was curriculum that was developed to teach about church, the LDS Church, but then also just Native characters.
Tom Trails. That's what I grew up with, the Tom Trails Seminary film strip. In fact, I was the president of the Tom Trails fan club. We loved that series so much, but looking back again, very problematic in how it's portrayed. As a kid, you don't know, they're just trying to teach the gospel principles using these cultural elements. But as an adult looking back, in fact, I have a story where, like I said, my friends and I loved this when we were kids. I found that whole film strip series of Tom Trails at DI one day. And so I thought, okay, I'm just out of college, newly married. Let's have a party where we show the film strip. And so we're all now in our 20s. We get back together. This is at BYU. We start watching, and it was sobering from the eyes of a 14-year-old to now the eyes of a 22-year-old. We're going, this we see it, and we stopped. We said, you know what, let's not watch any more of this. Let's just go out to dinner. But we definitely started to see it through different eyes. And I'm sure if I were to look at it today, I would see it through even more of a different perspective on it. So yeah, very interesting. But yep, that was a whole series back in the late 70s, or I think it ended in the late 70s. In ninth grade is when I think the time when I saw it. But yeah, certainly interesting.
I was going to say, that shows you how behind we are up where my brother, because we watched those like well into the 80s. Even the 90s we were watching those film strips.
Yeah.
But like I said, kind of going back to your question, Landon, is that I don't really see myself as Lamanite, and I always push back on that. And even though I haven't called that throughout my adulthood, right? Like I'm a good Lamanite, or, this or that, like I don't see myself as that. And even as being LDS, right? Like I, like probably many others, I've had variations in my faithfulness or how I see Mormonism and how I practice it. But ultimately, one of the things for myself is that I will always be Dakota, whether I'm Mormon or not. Right. And no one's ever going to really actually know that I'm LDS because I don't look LDS, right? By people's standards of what they think Mormons look like. And so even with my children, one of the things I teach them is that they are Dakota. My husband's Mexican. So we teach them about being both like from two different cultures. But that to me is more important, is instilling a sense of identity of who they are, because that's what's going to kind of become their foundation. Whether they exist within the context of Mormonism or not, they will always be Dakota, they will always be Mexican American. And that ideas like these identity struggles, I think, are highlighted with the Indian Student Placement Program. I think one of the challenges, and I think that's detrimental with the Indian Student Placement Program, because there are scholars who have written about it, but they write about it from a very Mormon perspective. And typically one of the books that's written about the Indian Student Placement Programs solely, as they focus on it within the Mormon context, and they write out the voices of those children who chose not to remain within the faith and that chose that to leave, or those that are very critical of the program. And I think that's the dangers of our collective history, is that when you have voices who don't fit into the mainstream narrative, right, of what we want to think about the LDS Church and the Indian Student Placement Program, they get left out completely. But it's detrimental, right? Like these structures of what it means to be Lamanite is the same thing as what the United States government has done to us as Indigenous people, to say you have to be enrolled, you have to have like blood quantum in order to be Native. And it's similar in the Mormon context, just very different because it's like religiously defined, but ultimately I think that's the thing that I take away from not just the Indian Student Placement Program, but even I think the rhetoric and discourse about this idea of Lamanite, is that you're never not going to be Lamanite because we will never not be brown. So, and I think that's the dangers, I think, of the Indian Student Placement Program, is that children who navigated those systems question their identity as Native people. They didn't fit into like the LDS Church neatly because they are marked as like Lamanite, right? Like this cursed other, their ancestors were cursed. Or even within their community, they're not fully accepted into their community, right? Because they're Mormon. And so they occupy like a lot of this interesting in-between space. And there are some people who are able to make that work for them effectively, where they can be both Mormon and Native at once. But I do think some people end up giving up a lot. And those that exist within, I think, primarily, I would say white systems or communities, end up giving a lot of their indigeneity up so that they can participate in ways that are comfortable for themselves.
Yeah, that is such an interesting point. And it reminds me of another friend that we have who is a tribal elder here in the area in Utah. And he told a story to us about, and he's older than we are. So he's, probably would have been growing up in the 60s, 70s, wouldn't you say, Landon?
Yeah.
So a different perspective on it. And he has the opportunity to meet with upper leadership in the church quite often. And he told us a story about going in and meeting with upper leadership, and they were talking, and he said something about, well, as a Lamanite, and he could see that everybody was looking really uncomfortable, right? The upper leadership, they're like, and he said it a couple times, if I remember the story right, Landon. And then finally, one of the, I think it was either general authorities or apostles. I think general authorities, someone said, we don't use that term anymore.
Mhm.
And he said, well, I do, because that's what you told me I was. And that's what I've been. I mean, this is a gentleman that's in his, older than we are. And he claimed that. And he almost said, from my perspective, it was like, you don't have the right to look uncomfortable. That's what you told me for decades that I was. And I'm going to refer to myself as that, because that's what I am. That's kind of how I feel about the word Mormon. When they got rid of that, I'm like, no, I'm a Mormon. That's why our podcast is called Mormonish.
What you told me. Yeah.
Called me that all those years, so there's that sense of that confusion in identity. And I'm sure that is generational as far as, younger people are going to have a different perspective. But yeah, that story's always stuck with me, that he said, you don't have the right to tell me I'm not that now, so everyone's sort of making their own peace with it, or not making peace with that, however you want to look at it. So what do you think about the changes that they've been trying to make? Like you mentioned, come follow me, things like that. I mean, it's definitely, people are taking notice, right? Where they didn't even 10 years ago. I don't think they really noticed anything about the scriptures that were so offensive. And now they're trying to make this effort to do it. What do you think about that?
I mean, I think it's like a good step in the right direction, but again, I think it's hard because like these ideas are going to persist as long as the Book of Mormon continues to exist, right? And it will, because it is a fundamental tenet of the faith. And so I think for me, like if you go to like their website, like the LDS Church's website, they've done a lot of stuff in terms of like, I forget the name of it, whether it's done on like it was something like violence in the 19th century, I think, with LDS Church, right, moving west. So they've tried to provide some more historical context. They've definitely made some, like, think, headways into looking at like fleshing out more this discussion in terms of what we would call like the Black priesthood ban, right? Like, and Paul Reeve wrote that wonderful book on like in terms of looking at, I think, the Jesuit book, like the ban in general, and I think having more of a conversation about it. But I think our numbers in the LDS Church, I think, are interesting because especially within the US context, the majority of members are going to be predominantly white. You don't really, I mean, the fast and growing segment, right, within the LDS Church is going to be, I would say, Central and South America. I forget like the exact numbers, but I think if you're trying to go for it to become a more global church, things have to change, definitions have to change. But I don't know how you cannot talk about Lamanite, because there are people who still claim it, like the elder that you mentioned. But even I think it's a former apostle. I don't know if they're still but Larry Echohawk, who again, Pawnee tribal member who used to work for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, high ranking, right, within like just the federal government in general. But he became, again, like since George P. Lee, right, the first native, like, or Lamanite. And again, that's another example, right? So like this idea that the LDS Church upheld George P. Lee until his excommunication as the poster boy for the Indian Student Placement Program, a graduate of BYU, right? Like until he was excommunicated, was held up and they kind of did that again with Larry Echohawk, because even when I used to Google kind of like recent iterations of what it means to be Lamanite, his talk would come up, and those were in general conferences where he like unashamedly claimed, right, like that he was Lamanite. That was like central to his identity. So I think you just can't get away from that when that rhetoric will still continue to exist within the LDS Church and the Book of Mormon.
Well,
That's where is
getting from. Yeah, I don't see how the LDS Church can get away from Lamanites, because the Book of Mormon was written for the Lamanites. That's what we're told. It was written to them. So they've got to have some Lamanites around, or who's the book for? Right. So it causes some problems.
Well, and that one I think is interesting, like theoretically, right? So like when I talk about like Mormon settler colonialism as this like project to build empire, but empire within a Mormon context is Zion, right? And so when you talk about like the building up of Zion, like that's never, as you're pointing out, is never going to not happen. You have to have, like, Mormon Zion cannot exist without Lamanites, right? And so then what does that mean? It just means that there's different iterations. Lamanite has changed over time too, right? So it used to be just like Joseph Smith would talk about the Western tribes in the US, but then as the LDS Church began their missionary efforts, it expanded to include Pacific Islanders. It expanded to include Central and South America. But I think it was that fluidity of identity is important because the goals of the LDS Church changed. And how do you get people to buy into a religion if there's no connection, right? And specifically, and so, but if you can say this is your people's history, I think that's promising to people to say, this is where I fit in, this is where I could fulfill this particular, like religious belief of like, we're saved. But I think there's like challenges within that, because I don't think that holds true for all Indigenous peoples.
Yeah, I think that's true. It's funny. I was going to a museum with my mom. She's in her 80s about a year ago. And there was a Pacific Islander family that was we were standing in line together trying to get into this exhibit. And she said, "Oh, look, a Lamanite family, Haygoth." She said it quietly to me, but I don't know. It just hit me as so incredibly offensive right there. Yet it's my mom, in the church for decades. And, here she is looking at this wonderful family. They have their own heritage. They were an LDS. They have their own everything. And instead, in her mind, these are Lamanites. This is Haygoth. She knows exactly who they are, and she'll never know who they really are. And that's just started me thinking that, it's not just this family. It's everyone. It's all of these civilizations, all of these people that Mormons have put in this nice little box. They will never know who they really are because they've already assigned who they are, their identity to the people. And it is set. Like we know it, just like my mom. Oh, look, a Lamanite family. It was so casual the way she said it. It was so disturbing to me,
It's like if you're in the Western Hemisphere or Oceania and you aren't white, you're a Lamanite.
You're a Lamanite. Yeah.
Somehow everyone's a Lamanite, but nobody's a Lamanite, at this point. When we were growing up, everyone was a Lamanite. The Pacific Islanders, the South, as you said, South America, Central America, Native Americans, any non-white pretty much in the Western Hemisphere was considered a Lamanite.
Right.
And they appropriated every one of those cultures to where, if you go to Samoa now, it's a large portion of that island is LDS. Even, you go to New Zealand, a lot of that population is LDS. You go, we know South America and Central America, how the baptisms were. And a lot of those people joined the church because they were told they were Lamanite and that there was this link, which, now DNA studies is showing that it wasn't. And now the church is saying, oh, well, they were just among those people. Well, yeah, but you've completely appropriated the culture in order to do that. And it seems like that's, what happened with the Indian Placement Program was, let's take them from their culture, put them into white Mormon culture, which is really very, very similar to what they were doing in the 1800s. When they came into Utah, they would often take kids or, they were trying to teach the Indians and convert the Native Americans there. And of course, we all know they were referred to as the battle axe of the Lord because they felt that they could use them as an army to fight the Americans and become a theocracy at some point, which completely failed. And that this just seems to be kind of the Indian Placement Program seems to be a remnant of that.
Good point.
Of that program or that original thinking when they got to Utah.
Right. I think again, if you look at the 19th century kind of rhetoric, even with Brigham Young, right, this idea in terms of warfare, it's cheaper basically to feed them and educate them than it is to fight them. Those attitudes don't necessarily change per se. They just kind of evolve and they're implemented in very different ways. And so those early Lamanite policies of just initial conversion, right, change in the 20th century to become exactly the Indian Student Placement Program is a good example, right? Where it's really about assimilating Native children, but specifically within a Mormon context. And it's that idea, right? That Mormonism ultimately is going to save Native people. But I think it's interesting because if you look at literature about boarding schools in general and Indian child removal policies, there's very little about Mormons in general, even though Mormons played an important role, in which I argue, right, like, is that the Indian Student Placement Program was just another policy by the LDS Church of Indian child removal. It just happened within the intimacy of Mormon homes. And so I think that in and of itself, in terms of looking at what, scholars call like the intimacies of colonialism, that, or like Margaret Jacobs in her book calls about maternal colonialism, it's really the homes that become, right, like the structure in which Indigenous people are going to become assimilated, but specifically within the US context, and then specifically again within like the Mormon context. And I think, again, like I try to understand it where Mormons are unfortunately not unique, right? The LDS Church, and we like to think that we're unique peoples. We are a peculiar people, right? But also we're not exactly unique in our policies. Like what Joseph Smith and Brigham Young and many other leaders have done are not unlike what the US has done in their attitudes towards Native peoples. And specifically, right, like at this time period, like if we're saying 1947 was the illegal beginning of this particular program that extended well into the 1990s, but the 1950s in the United States, specifically with the federal government, if you place the context of the Indian Student Placement Program within that, the idea of the United States government, where they're trying to get out of what they call the Indian business, where they're no longer trying to uphold, treaties, they're terminating tribes and that federal trust responsibility. The church aided in that. And what's interesting is when you have the passage of the Indian Child Removal Act, or Indian Child Welfare Act, excuse me, that was passed in 1978, there's always what I call like the Mormon exemption to that, because their argument was that they're not removing children to like basically adopt them. They're simply just a foster care program. And you had George P. Lee, who testified in front of Congress to say, Mormons are unique. We're not trying to do anything. We're just trying to provide a different type of foster care system. And they were allowed to continue to their program. And again, there was more oversight put into place, especially through Utah State, the state itself, with social workers, but the LDS Church aided in larger US policies of assimilation and termination of Native people, because the goal is that Native people would cease to exist as sovereign nations, but as individuals. And part of that, especially when we talk about within Mormonism, it means to become Mormon. But in this context and in the American context, it's really to become like white, to let go of your identity, right? And to assume this identity that the LDS Church has, I would say, manufactured and produced, right? That is relegated to like the Book of Mormon, right? To say you exist in this context, and that's the only way you exist. Because without that, then a lot of the claims the LDS Church makes about their presence on Indigenous land, I think we can contest that, and we should still continue to contest, Mormon presence on Indigenous land.
What do you think about, of course, we all remember the President Kimball quote, right? About the little girl sitting between her parents. And, they bring that out now a lot of just look how egregious this is. But, when we were growing up, that was sort of an inspiring story, right? Which is so horrific to look back. Again, we're having this hindsight moment as adults and being more aware and just going, how did we think that was okay? But yeah, that quote is something else.
Right. And I think especially with that quote, right? Like right, compare her to like the other kids, like on basically the reservation, their communities. But it was like that physical manifestation, right? That these children are becoming white and delightsome. And it's interesting, right? Is like those photos, like I always call them the before and after photos, right? That's what happened with like boarding schools. There's like these interesting photos. Tom Torlino is the most popular one I even showed in my intro class on Native Studies, is where it's like the before, right? Here's this young Apache child who left, right? This is how he arrives at boarding school within his like traditional, clothing, etc., long hair. And look what we've been able to do. We've been able to civilize him. And then he's wearing very much like military clothing, right? Short hair, and looks physically lighter. But that's also because you have kids inside all day. They're not outside the way they were like in their communities, right?
That is such a good point.
And so I think that's part of it too, is like that rhetoric, right? And that the images used as this is like a physical manifestation of the effectiveness of our civilization program, which was the Indian Student Placement Program. This is how well we're doing. We're saving these kids. Look how great they're doing. And yes, it's easy, I think, to say that it's problematic now because our understanding of that has changed. Our understanding, I think, of like race and difference has changed. But at the time, like those structures exist because it really is about marking, right, like the other as problematic. And that's like Lamanite, right? Lamanites are problematic because they're uncivilized. They've lost their traditions. And if they just accepted Mormonism, that would kind of fix what's wrong with Indian people. But that's obviously not the case. It takes out the context of the systems in which we exist today is because of the effects of colonialism, right? Not because we just are like a backwards people in general.
Yeah, and I guess I should mention what this Kimball scenario we're talking about is. I always forget everybody doesn't know, right,
Yes,
Landon?
I was going to
I'm
say,
always
you need to
notorious
say
for
that quote. Yeah.
But exactly. But it was President Kimball, and I don't have it exactly. We can put it in the show notes. But he saw a child that was in the placement program between the parents, if I remember, and said, look at the child. Look how much lighter the child is than the parents, meaning exactly what you said, that it's working basically. But Landon and I were talking as we were getting ready for this, just about the whole idea of this covenant, right? That the Lamanite will blossom as a rose. The Lamanite will be the one that will, be the covenant people who the Americas were set aside for, and that's a huge promise and a huge blessing that the rest of us were like, well, I don't know if I ever felt I needed to do my part in that. I think most of us didn't know what we were supposed to do, but it was something that just was so big. We had no idea what that would even look like. Just this covenant promise idea of these very special people set apart, yet then we have all the other things going on and the treatment. So it's kind of a juxtaposition there. I don't know. Kind of interesting.
There is that one where, so there is that proclamation, or maybe it was just made to foster parents, but it talks about that the sons and daughters of Zion will soon be required to donate a portion of their time in instructing the children of the forest.
Yes.
I think they're referring to Indigenous peoples, for they must become educated and instructed in all arts of civil life as well as the gospel. So that rhetoric is interesting that it's there, right? Like where people are supposed to help and aid in that. But I think ultimately, it sounds great to say Indigenous peoples or Lamanites, right, are supposed to fulfill this covenant, this promise, right, that they are going to become leading Zion, etc. But in doing so, that displaces everybody else, including Mormon settlers. And I think that's why it's never going to happen in terms of Native people taking their rightful choice, or place. So it's interesting, as we've talked about already, the diversity or spectrum in which Indigenous people see themselves as Lamanite or not Lamanite. And when I was a graduate student, I had an older elder in a community that I was just visiting. We were chatting about it, and he was very much an activist. He was involved in a lot of activism within his community. But one of the things he told me was telling me Elise, I like your ideas, they're interesting, but also remember that he took a very critical book reading of the Book of Mormon, and in fact said that if we read it correctly, that it's actually Lamanite people who are going to usher in the second coming. It's just Gentiles are supposed to help us, but Gentiles have forgotten their place. And so I think it's really interesting to see different ways in people identify and fit themselves within that. But I think in general, I would say general membership of the LDS Church, I don't think is ready for that type of conversation, because I think it would upend a lot of things that people know, right, about the early church history and religious persecution, right, and kind of our goals of what we're supposed to be preparing for. I think that I don't know, I think that would just mess with people too much.
Well, that would make you think that we should see a lot more Indigenous people in leadership positions if they're the ones who are going to usher it in. And it seems the opposite, that they almost try. I mean, we have none in the upper Q15. I know that there's some, depending on what you call a Lamanite, if it's people from South America, Central America, and others. But, now they're growing in Africa. And it seems like, well, are we just leaving the Lamanite behind at this point? Who's, that's who the Book of Mormon says is supposed to come forth and usher in the second coming. And it seems like that is falling further and further away, where we don't even identify Lamanites any longer, or we want to identify them as Lamanites for the Book of Mormon purposes, but we don't want to for any other purposes, it seems like.
Right. Well, and I think just that point about the leadership in general, I think is really interesting, because I don't think our church leadership reflects our membership. Like it's typically I would call it that white savior complex, right? That like even if we talk about the organization from the top down, where are people entering into those conversations or within the structures? And those that eventually enter into those structures are those that are going to also be socioeconomically well off. So you cut off a lot of base, but like my own experience has been, and even though like my father has been like a branch president where we grew up in Poplar, the majority of my experience growing up is that they have always had non-native people coming in. And I always like that was, I would say, as a child, kind of going back to maybe to one of the previous questions of like that idea of Lamanite, was I could never understand why there wasn't like we couldn't pick from our own membership, like men in the community to be in leadership position. And granted, my dad served, I forget how long, or for maybe a couple different times, but like in general, I was like, I don't understand why would they always have to drive in. Some people would drive in an hour to be, to serve as like either the branch president or whatnot. But it goes back to, at least I think my own personal perception and opinion, was that people just don't think that we as Indigenous people, I think, are capable or able to consistently, you know, lead ourselves. We always have non-Indian people come in, even as missionaries. One of the missionaries that don't work in our communities are those that don't understand our culture, or who are very much trying to be, I don't know, they just are problematic in some ways, but that's not unique to my community. I see that in other places. Even here in Toppenish, when we have the Spanish branch, oftentimes where people are coming in because they're Spanish speakers from their mission, but there's tons of brothers in the branch that could have served, just don't get called to serve for some reason. But I think it goes back to these ideas that they're just either not ready for service or whatnot, in the ways that they should be.
Yeah, no, that reminds me of, do you remember this? It was a picture of leadership in some African branch, and it had, all the brothers that were serving there that were African. And then when it got to the very top, it had, three very white, whoever they were, the presiding this and that or area. And we're just like, oh, can you be that tone deaf to put this out? It just looks terrible.
Well, and I think the church, doesn't the church have I don't know if they call it Indian Affairs Committee or something like that, which I believe is run by a white elder. Yeah.
This was what was described by this tribal elder that went to talk to the church. He said, oh yeah, I went to talk to elder so-and-so. He's in charge of, and he did call it Indian Affairs. So I'd never heard of it, but I felt like there must be something.
I was just trying to look it up. I can't find it, but yeah.
This was not too long ago.
No, they're coming back. In fact, where I live in South Dakota, we lived near several different communities depending on how far you drive and in what direction, but we were invited as part of the stake to participate in something for their Indian members. Like I can't remember the email said if it was American Indian members, but we went all the way to, I think it was Omaha Reservation, and we met, I think it was somebody from the 70, one of the apostles came in, but he was overseeing any Indian affairs from Missouri all the way up to Montana and maybe Canada. But I think, again, it goes back to there's different iterations where there's been a concerted effort into tribal communities to, again, whether they want to call it Lamanite or not, there's still efforts to convert, I think, Indigenous peoples. It just is not, I think there's always highs and lows in some tribal communities, but there is somebody, and I don't know the official title of them, but yeah, there's something there, even if they don't officially call it. It's also the same way when I have asked, especially when I've done research, can you tell me like statistics or numbers in terms of how many people are American Indian? And they always say that they don't keep track of that information. And I really find that hard to believe, because I think as a church, like we are the most record-keeping people. Yeah. And so I just find it hard to believe that we couldn't find that somewhere. But you really allegedly can't find that. And so, yeah, I don't know whether they call it Lamanite or not. There's still policies, I think, in place to try to convert people.
Yeah, I think there are too. And I think I had a relative when I was growing up who it must have been anyway, he was serving in some capacity where he was on as a missionary going to a reservation. I can't remember where now, but I remember there was a lot of talk about blossoming like a rose, all of that. And he's serving. So then I flash forward to, 40 whatever years later, my own son is on a mission in Arizona, and he's also a zone leader, and he's spending time on the reservation, right? Teaching people. There was no rhetoric like that at all about the blossoming on there's an airplane flying by. I bet you can hear that. That's crazy. But I just compare the difference that was the rhetoric when I was growing up, and I had a relative serving in that as a missionary, that it was all about the blossom like a rose. Right. And then future tense, just maybe 5 or 6 years ago, not at all. It was just conversion, just working with people, but no special meaning around it. So it is interesting for me to see how that's changed.
Right.
Elise, what do you say to the person? I took a trip to South Dakota. This was, our kids were young, so 20 years ago or so, to see Mount Rushmore and all the things that are there. And as I drove along the highway on the way there, we went through several reservations. I think Sioux mainly, maybe Lakota. And my heart broke as I drove through and saw the poverty on these reservations. And I couldn't help but say, how do I help these people? This is awful, these conditions. How did we end up with these people? And I guess I didn't understand it because I've always grown up, in an urban area and everything. So when I got out and saw that poverty of such a beautiful people, the Lakota, the Sioux, just such a beautiful background. What do you say to the person who says, well, the Indian Placement Program was to help bring people out of that and lift them up, and so wouldn't that be a positive thing?
Yeah, I think that's definitely an attitude, that idea in terms of looking at poverty, right, as something in which Indigenous people are I would say it's a deficient way of looking at our communities, because I think our socioeconomic status is an obvious thing to point at. But I would say the conditions as we exist today are because of those same policies of lifting Native people, but done by the United States government. And I think just having people a general understanding is that policies, much like the LDS Church's policies or Lamanite policies, like the Indian Student Placement Program, well, perhaps good intention from their perspective, are ultimately problematic because you're not looking at it from their community perspective. And policies in general, like the conditions that exist in our communities, is because of the United States government. If you look at the policies that were passed by whether presidents, right, or by Congress, we as a people in general, as Indigenous people, were never meant to live beyond the 1900s. Policies, if you look, a steady decline in our population by the turn of the 1900s, right, we were supposed to continue steadily falling until we no longer existed as a people. And that was on purpose and deliberate. Our reservations exist in some of our tribal homelands, but they're also very rural. They're not, and the conditions that are in our communities are designed to bring about the end of life. We also have the end of traditional food ways, and, whether it's the buffalo, whether it's gathering, hunting, etc., that fundamentally changes a people. But ultimately, I would say the Indian Student Placement Program, it's really this idea that you're looking outside, right, our communities, and you don't see the good within our communities. And I think there's a lot of good within our communities that, despite all of these policies, including the Indian Student Placement Program, we still have our language, we still have our culture, we still have our identity as Native peoples. So whether that's Dakota, Lakota, etc., we still exist as a people. And in fact, I think we've defied the odds of genocidal policies, which include religious assimilation, that we have maybe we worked within these structures, we exist within these structures, but at our core of our being, that we are still Indigenous regardless. And so I think for me, I always look at some of these I've had this conversation with my husband when I actually brought him back to my community for the first time, to introduce him to my relatives. And because he's from Mexico, it's an interesting perspective, because his idea was like, he grew up with this idea of like the American dream. Like you go into like the US, right? Like you want to, it's about the accumulation of wealth, etc. And it's a different shift in perspective where I said, like, that's not what we believe in as a people. We don't value material things. You know, what we value is kinship. What we value is one another. We value our language, our culture, our homelands. That is ultimately more important than, you know, having a home, having all of these other things. Like, and the fact that, like I said, like we're still here. And so I think for me, like when I look at the effects of like the Indian student placement program, I think it honestly did a lot of harm. I think there are some students who and children who made the best of it, because I think that shows the resiliency that we have as a people, that we can go into institutions and places, you know, that are anti-Indian for the most part, and we can still exist because we do it on our terms. But I think ultimately, in general, the intention was meant to be detrimental. And I think despite all of that, I think what I've seen, at least from children and who participated with the Indian Student Placement Program, is like, I don't think they would have done it again if given the opportunity. Knowing what they know now, I don't think they would have done it. But I also think people at the time made very difficult choices. Parents sent their children because they felt that they had an obligation to do so. Maybe not just because they're Mormon, but they felt like through treaty obligations, we're required by the United States government to give our children an education. Let's send them off, because at least we think in Mormon homes, there's going to be less harm caused to our kids. So they took that alternative route versus like mission schools or, you know, federal schools and etc. But I think ultimately the purpose of all these educational goals is that it was meant to, that infamous phrase, right, by Captain Richard Henry Pratt, right, who like founded Indian boarding schools, was to kill the Indian, save the man, right? And so that's the same thing in this, in the sense of the Mormon, where it's interesting because like this Lamanite, it's like kill the Lamanite, save the man in some sense, but like it's interesting where Lamanite is like part of that identity, but you can't be too Lamanite because we actually want you to be fully Lamanite. And so I think that's the hard part, right? Because unlike I
We
think
want you to be a Nephite Lamanite.
A Nephite Lamanite, that's it.
yeah. So like it's a weird kind of, it's weird, right? Because it's like this in-between space where like you're at once a promised and fallen people, but I think it's convenient then because it never then the LDS Church, or just these structures or programs, you never have to fully realize and recognize, I think, Indigenous people as fully human, and that we have our own agency, that we can exist out without these colonial institutions. And I think that's again like one of the dangers of programs like this. In hindsight, we can say it's problematic, but at the time, people felt like it was the most wonderful program in general. And you still have people who sing its praises today, you know. And I will say, and I acknowledge and recognize like all my Indigenous relatives who, you know, say that Indian Student Placement Program saved their lives. It's gave them opportunities. That is true. I also had an aunt who went on Indian Student Placement Program. She was also a young like Lamanite missionary that was like before they were 18 could serve in various capacities. But what's interesting about my aunt is that she had a lot of opportunities. She talked about flying an airplane for the first time. She, in fact, stayed with one of President Kimball's brothers and had a lot of different opportunities. But if you look at my aunt today, I've never seen my aunt claim to be fully Mormon. She doesn't go to church every Sunday. She's, in fact, very much Dakota, knows a lot of our traditional ways. And I just find that interesting. So I think that does, like, it shows that, you know, it wasn't the best program for everybody, although some people participated, I think, and made the most of it.
So it sounds like what you're saying is kind of what we talked about earlier. The problem with the program is it had no Lamanite leadership back in the 70s, or Indigenous people leadership who could comment and say, the way you guys are seeing it isn't the way we as a people see it, and could advise them that, you know, this was a problem or could become problematic because it was white men making the decision for Indigenous peoples and what was best for their children. And we all know if you're Mormon and Indigenous, just like if you're Mormon and white, when the prophet says, send your kids here, you send your kids.
Yeah.
Because you've been, you know, the
Told to
prophet
do
of
it.
the Lord has spoken. So,
Right. Right. And I think in general too, like, so like, So we talk about it very much within the LDS context, but I think in general, like this idea of education is very interesting because it's very much, I think, a Western like construct in the ways we think about education. And I think to me, that's why boarding schools and even the Indigenous Placement Program don't necessarily work, is because it doesn't really work from that Indigenous perspective in the way we think about how we educate our young people. And what we know about education today knows, right? You can call it the Montessori method, you can call it all sorts of different things, right? But when you make education that's tailored for that particular child and where that child can see themselves reflected in the world around them and in the curriculum, children excel. And these children who are going into these very white places who don't see themselves in the teachers, they don't see themselves in their classmates, they don't see themselves even in the curriculum, that ends up doing, I think, more harm to one's psyche than I think we really tend to understand. So it's not just like the program itself. I think it's how we think about what is education, what does it look like, and what does it mean? I mean, you hear this term like thrown around a lot in terms of indigenizing education, but I think like if you just looked at education, I think in a different context too, then just as you were saying, then we would have a different understanding of what could have been more effective or useful for young people beyond just removing them from the homes. Because in that context, what we're saying is that the parents aren't capable, the homes are not good enough, their communities are not good enough. You have to leave to get good education when in fact there's good education and good homes. It's just the lack of like resources. And I think that's the other thing, right? Kind of going, I think back to your previous question about poverty. I think we had resources available in communities. A lot of these things that we attribute right to, would like to poverty would be addressed because then you have the necessary resources that other parents have.
With all the urbanization and how unconnected from the land we've become, it almost seems like we should have a white placement program where whites get put with Native Americans to reconnect with the land. We read the book. What was the book?
Braiding Sweetgrass.
Braiding
Yes, our book
Sweetgrass. What a
club.
wonderful
Oh my
book.
goodness,
And
such
yes,
a beautiful Robin
it's
Wall
like
Kilmer.
I could send my kid to learn from the Native Americans
Yeah.
about the land and about how we should treat our resources and different things. It's almost like the roles should be flipped at this point, because I think there's a lot to be learned there.
No, I talk about this, like, so I come very much as I'm a professor, right? I teach in Native American studies. But that's the challenge I always give to my students is like, now that you know what you know, like, how do you incorporate that back into your own communities or your own families and friends, etc. But I think that's the other part is I teach a class specifically called Contemporary Issues, and we look at what issues are like in our tribal communities, but I actually have my students identify one thing that they're interested in addressing and what would be their solution to it. And oftentimes students, especially my non-native students, pick things that are relevant. So whether it's looking at like environment, right, issues as you're pointing out, like food sovereignty, etc., like they look at how Indigenous knowledge, right, can now be utilized to address some of these issues that we're facing. And I think you're right, there has to be a flip in some way, but that's again going back to value other people's perspectives and worldviews and understanding things that we've known for time immemorial. People are just figuring out. Even Dakota people, we always say that we're a star people, that we come from the stars, right? And now science is telling us that there's basically stardust in our bodies, our bones, right? But we've known that for forever, right? And so why is it now just that science is catching up? So I think there's definitely, right, as you point out with like braiding sweetgrass, there's always ways that I think Indigenous knowledge can inform the way that we see our world, the way that our relationship to land, but also I will point out the relationship to one another and this idea of kinship. And so I know when I started, I talked about like kinship in our communities, right? Like the way we see everybody as like a relative, we treat each other as a relative, and that changes how we interact with one another. But I think if we did that just on a individual level now, it changes, I think, the way we not just view each other but how we interact, but also like I would say like public and political discourse that we experience now here in the US. I think it would change if we just had a better understanding of one another, really on that human level.
Yeah, it's a great perspective. Yeah.
Well, we certainly appreciate all that you've brought to this, because this has been, very interesting to me.
Yes.
And uh, I don't I don't get to run into, we've got a few friends who are Native Americans that we've just really enjoyed. We've gotten to do several tours with him and experience some of the things, and it's just such a beautiful culture. And we all need to have more more Lamanite friends because there's so much to learn from you, and I've never really gotten to ask these questions. I've always wondered that, how do people who are told they're Lamanites see themselves within the church? Because I just see so many people, or especially South and Central America, the church has so successfully used this narrative that, oh, these are your ancestors, come be part of the church because we're all about your ancestors. And then, to find out just recently in the last 30 years maybe that the DNA just shows that that's not at all where they come from, and what that must have done to those groups as they learn, no, you're not, and whether it's shattered their testimonies, whether it hasn't mattered to their testimonies. Have you seen anything in that, or what's been your perspective on that? Because you said yourself that your father joined kind of from that, oh, I'm a Lamanite, this is my history. But by the second generation, you're saying, I didn't really believe that. I saw myself more as a Native American than I did as a Lamanite or a Mormon. Have you seen that shifting over time, or what's been your...
I think it's like, I don't know if I could say it's like families and how they're being raised. That wasn't like our predominant theme of being raised. Like my dad wasn't always like, you're a Lamanite, we're Lamanites. Like I never really heard that growing up. Like unless we were talking specifically about the LDS Church and like maybe the Book of Mormon or his experiences as like a convert, and then he served a mission, right, for the LDS Church. And like what's interesting, because my dad's Dakota, like I don't know if they thought every native was the same, but they sent him to Navajo Nation thinking he could speak Navajo. And he always laughs about it now, but I was like, that is so problematic, Dad. And I just don't know if it's like his generation. But I will say that like the DNA studies in general, if you're interested in looking at stuff, I highly recommend reading the work of Kimberly Tallbear. She's a Dakota scholar who writes a lot about like debunking like the use of DNA just in general. Like that's not going to convey and determine like, indigeneity in general. Most identity, I would say, like I tell my students, I can say I'm from Fort Peck or from Poplar, but like, does your community claim you? Does your community acknowledge who you are? Do they claim you? Do they know your relatives? But I think going back to others, like I always think Central and South America are interesting. And there's some interesting scholars, and I'm totally blanking on his name, and I apologize. There's a new book that just came out about Peru, and LDS members in Peru.
We just had him on. We just
Oh,
barely
okay.
did.
I've
Yeah.
got the
And we
book
have copies of
downstairs.
his book. Damn, we should hold that book up.
Lo-
Yeah, he's amazing.
Yes.
yeah.
But his work, I just met him at the Mormon History
Oh,
Association like 2
great.
weeks ago.
Oh, good.
And I just thought his work was really fascinating because it is really interesting where people tie into that heritage. And you'll see that in other parts, not just in Peru, I think in like parts of Mexico. There's always those ideas, like then there's those Book of Mormon tours of the land, right? Where
Yes.
we don't know this is, but we think this is where it could be. So I think it's interesting because I think to me, the big question is this idea of belonging. People want a sense of belonging, and how do they fit themselves into something that I think is a very American religious tradition. And I think that's one way to do it, is to say the Book of Mormon, right? Or because we hear about these different stories, this is our connection to it. And I think it's ways that people can kind of like make sense of who they are and fit it in within this like LDS context. But I think that goes for a lot of different communities. It's trying to, I think, curate that very specific sense of belonging, and some people really do believe it. And it's not for me to say like that's true or not true, but I'm just fascinated by like the desire to do so. But I think just in general, like I think that will continue to persist, as I said before, as long as the Book of Mormon continues to persist and be part of like Mormon religious discourse. So too is Lamanite identity, and so too is Lamanite history. And people are going to see, especially on this American continent, figure out how they intersect within that particular history or within that narrative, even if we may not make sense of it all the time.
Yep, I agree with that. I think it's absolutely not going away anytime soon. Let's say that, right? Not at all. They may change that forward in the Book of Mormon yet again. Who knows what they'll change it to, but there's no getting around it at all. And it is interesting to see my parents' perspective, my mom saying there's a Lamanite family, you know, myself interacting with a Lamanite placement child, and then the DNA. You just see this whole trajectory over somebody that's our age, and I just kind of choose not to think about it because you can't make sense of it, really. It's so different. And if we were to have somebody who is 20 years old on right now, they would have a completely different perspective on what that means. What does it mean, the covenant of the Lamanite and the nation? And, you know, it's I think it's evolving, maybe, is what we're talking
I think every generation sees it differently. And like we said, you know, if you were an LDS person here in 1850, your belief of what a Lamanite consisted of is different than what it was when we were here in 1970. And now here in 2024, it's the younger generation sees it completely different than we did.
Well, and that's my hope, is for younger people to make sense of their identity on their own terms. And I do think, like our young people, I'm always excited about the cool stuff that they're doing. And within the Indigenous context, I will say that like the young Lakota, Dakota children and students I get to work with are awesome because they are embracing their culture, their language, their identity as Lakota, Dakota people. And that to me is, I think, exciting because they're envisioning a world that I think we've been hoping for, but they're the ones that are brave enough to do it and to let go of all of these like external ways of knowing and just really focus on their own ways.
Can you, this kind of maybe a last question here, but how would you, as a Indigenous person, what advice would you give to someone who is a white person who's looking at it and saying, how can I best learn, what resource or what thing could I best do to understand the Indigenous cultures around me?
That's a really good and complicated question. I think
3 hours later.
I always encourage students first is like, one, because you and your listeners are from, you know, all sorts of different places, is where do you live and what nations lived there before? And I think that's a good starting point, is like, so let's say if I lived right now in like where I live right now in Vermilion, South Dakota, you know, that's the one question I always ask my students the first day of class is like, you know, where are you from? And then like what tribal nations, you know, lived there before. And a lot of my students can't answer that. And so that's the one thing I will say is like to go look, you know, nearby. The other thing is I always ask in my students in South Dakota context, but I did teach at University of Utah for 2 years, and I asked my students there the same thing. Where are the nearest tribal nations? And majority of students could not answer that, even though we lived in Salt Lake City. And so it's interesting. So I will say, start from that. What are the nations that exist near you today? But also, where are the traditional homelands of the people in which you live today, right? Because there are various different tribal nations that overlapped with like one another in traditional homelands. And then I would look up people in tribal communities, you know, so in, let's say, the Utah context, who are elders, right, who have written books or who have, even on YouTube. I'm always amazed at what you can find on YouTube with elders. What can you find about their stories and their history? But I always encourage people to privilege Indigenous voices, etc. And I'll put in a plug for one of my, I really enjoy hearing him talk, but Darren Perry, right?
That's what we're talking about.
Yeah. I put that in my little notes because I was like, that sounds like Darren. Because
that sounds like Darren. Yeah, it was Darren.
Yeah. But somebody like Darren, right?
I love you, Darren.
Understand that, like, even Darren's perspective, right, of like Eastern Shoshone is going to be different than people who live in Fort Hall, right? Because their bands had like divided or, you know, separated. But I think in general, like, find people who have like really good things to say, who've written things. The Utes, for example, like have written so much different stuff as well. They've helped develop curriculum in Utah, I know, for K through 12. So I would say start there, listen to oral histories. The University of Utah Library has an amazing oral history collection as well that was collected in the 1970s. So I would say if you want to listen to like original recordings, if they're open for the public, request to look at things like that. But also go into tribal communities. If you're passing through tribal communities, visit there. Like, for example, in Papa, we have our community college, but we have a tribal bookstore. You can go in there. We have like a whole selection of books that you can choose from. But I would say do research and then find scholars and other people who write good work. Like you mentioned, Braiding Sweetgrass. That was one of these few books I think that transcended just the Native audience, right? Like it really went, I would say, especially nationally, even internationally. They have a children's version of it as well. And I would say the other thing is like to teach your young people the history, to especially in Utah. I think in general, like one of the things I think people have a hard time doing is to acknowledge that we all exist on Indigenous land. We all have benefited from the dispossession of Indigenous people, the genocide of Indigenous people. If you are existing on, somewhere here in the United States, and anywhere globally, you are on Indigenous land. And then also, I think the obligation then is to educate yourself at the very least, but also even in your friend group. Anytime you hear things that I think are problematic, right, or stereo, or oh, I don't think that sounds right, or you really shouldn't say that, then I think you have an obligation to point that out, because people are more likely going to listen to you than they are going to listen to somebody like me, because I am different from them, right? I am, and I think that's where change is made, but also education. You can't claim ignorance. Just teach yourself and read and reach out to communities and check out tribal websites. They oftentimes have their own histories, sometimes a list of resources that you can kind of just start with as like a starting point. And then reach out to people too. And you can always ask questions. I think most people are always, willing to answer questions if you have them.
Yeah, I would say that's probably great advice, because we stopped at the Bear River Massacre site, and wow,
Yeah.
that just touched all of us that were there, and we were like, what happened here? So we bought the book, and it was Darren Perry's book. And then he was giving a speech somewhere, and we went, it was at a hot springs. We sat in a hot spring with him as he told the stories and stuff. And that's how we got to know Darren. And from there, we got to go with him to the Bear River Massacre site, and he gave us a tour. And we just have learned so much from him, and really appreciated that heritage and, the horrible story of what happened to his people. That's just a horrible story. And yeah, that's it. It saddens me, because I go to Fort Hall, and I drive through there, and there's a gas station, a casino, and I'm going, well, this isn't what I'm looking for. I want to understand these people better, where they came from, or how they interacted. And I think there's a tribal museum there, but it never seems to be open. I want to get into that when I go by, but there's so much to learn and such a rich history.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say, like, again, Darren's great, but also like expand too, right? Like Darren's like one perspective, and everyone has different perspectives as well. And I think that's the important thing to point out too, is that, a lot of communities, we have various different elders, and that every elder offers up a different perspective, and that we believe that all perspectives are true, right? And that even if they may conflict or be slightly different from one another, that's okay. Those differences are okay. And oftentimes I think the Western world, especially academics, we want one way, but in Native communities, that's just not the case. Everybody's stories has like a different perspective, and that it's all, it's our truth, even if we may not like it, and even if it's uncomfortable.
And one other thing I would add is, I think Indigenous people's culture has been widely unknown. I don't think it's been appreciated for what it is. I've been to Egypt, and gotten to see, those early civilizations, but I've also been to Chaco Canyon. I've been to Hovenweep, Mesa Verde. Wow, those
Incredible.
are every bit as impressive as the sites in Egypt. You walk through there and you go, who were these people? Where did they come from? How did they live? Fremont State Park, the rock art. Oh, we love going and seeing the rock art and appreciation of the art. That's one of the areas I wish I knew more people who could tell me the native side of, at least their traditions or how they see it. We have a great friend, Dr. John Lundwall, who studies all that rock art, and we've learned a lot from. But to see the native perspectives is just something that is just wow, as we've experienced those. So there's a lot of those that most people don't even know are out there. I talk to so many people and say, "Have you been to Hovenweep?"
Like,
Hovenweep, where's that? And I'm going, oh my gosh, you got to go see Hovenweep.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
Yeah, I think that's a great because like I think connecting people right to like the land and like to whether it's like state parks or national parks, right? I think there's a lot of better interpretations that are being done, especially at national park, under the National Park Service, for example. On my way over from South Dakota, we happened to be traveling through Cheyenne and Crow Country on June 25th, which is Victory Day, where it's Battle of Greasy Grass, and I brought my boys up to that monument, and we like there's like the main monument that used to be there, kind of what Darren Perry talks about in terms of the Bear Creek River massacre, right? The Utah Daughters of Pioneer versus like their community. And understand, right, like there's different perspectives, and same thing in Battle of Greasy Grass. There's like the original, and then there's like more of like a native interpretation of like that particular site and its importance. But yes, encouraging people to do that in general, I think, is always good. And I would just say support like native scholars and artists. There's a lot of novels out there too. So if you're interested in novels, like that's a good foray into reading, about native peoples, especially by native scholars or writers, I should say. And then just in general, I would say like there's always questions I have from people who ask if they can buy like even native art or wear certain things. And I always say, do that, support native artists. When you mentioned Fort Hall has amazing artists and like people that sell a lot of their like art to, tourists or just people going through. But that's another way too, if you're just wanting to support native peoples, you can support it by, purchasing art or whatnot.
They've got great blankets at Fort Hall. Those thick, heavy blankets. Wow. And they last forever.
I need one. I'm always cold, perpetually cold. Maybe that's what'll finally warm me up. So, well, this has just been wonderful. And I love it. It's such a complex conversation. It's an ongoing conversation. And I'm just glad that we had a tiny little part of it today. So we thank you, Elise. It's been wonderful. And all the things that we mentioned, we'll put links in the show notes to the different books and the things that we've been talking about, because it's really important. And I found, like Landon said, when you look for it, or at least start having an interest in it, you'll find it, because it's true. Connecting with somebody like Darren Perry, going on various tours with him, ending up at a blessing of the Great Salt Lake. We ended up there last fall. I was looking
Carl
around.
Moore, is that
what?
Carl? I think Carl Moore did the dance there.
Did the dance. Yeah. And I just remember having this moment where I'm like, how interesting life is. How did I end up here doing this? It's absolutely incredible. And, just one thing kind of leads to the next, and touring different sites and just having a desire, I think, is where it starts. And then just things open up and unfold for you, and you can be exposed to something maybe you never even knew that you might be missing in your life. That's how I kind of feel about it. So, all right. Well, please comment. Let us know what you all think. Were you ever aware of the Indian Lamanite Placement Program? Did you perhaps have somebody in your own home? I've talked to friends that have, or in your neighborhood. It's a big conversation and ever changing. So we'll continue talking about it. Please like and subscribe to Mormonish Podcast. And if you'd like to be made aware when new episodes come out, you can hit that notification bell. If you would like to donate financially and help support Mormonish Podcast, we have links in the show notes to a donor box. We are a 501(c), and we really appreciate all of those of you that do help us out and donate. We can't tell you how much that means to us. And it continues to let us have amazing guests like Elise come on our show, which is wonderful. So we also have links to our merch store. If you feel the burning desire to have a Mormonish mug, you can take care of that by going to our show notes. Oh, there you go, Landon. Take a drink. And again, we'll just thank Elise, and thank you so much, Landon, for co-hosting. And we'll see everybody next time on Mormonish Podcast. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of Mormonish. We really appreciate our listeners and would love to hear from you if you have a story you'd like to share. You can email us at mormonishpodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and on our website, mormonishpodcast.org. And don't forget to look for us on YouTube and like and subscribe. Keep joyful, everybody.